Greetings, everyone. Welcome, frauders and sorors and dear friends, to our Wednesday Grand Lodge teleconference. We are so glad that you could join us today. My name is Ingrid Young, and I am the Assistant Editor-in-Chief of the Rose Quadjournal. We are pleased to let you know that we launched our latest volume, Volume 15 of the Rose Quadjournal, on March 20th, the vernal equinox. You can find it at rosequadjournal.org. And I'll spell that. It's Rose, R-O-S-E, trois, as in the French word for cross, C-R-O-I-X, journal.org. So that's rosequadjournal.org. Rose, R-O-S-E, C-R-O-I-X, journal.org. The Rose Quadjournal is seeking papers for its next online issue, and the deadline for submission of papers is May 15th. Both Rosicrucian members and non-members are invited to submit papers for consideration. The Rose Quadjournal accepts academic papers on various subjects of a transdisciplinary nature. Topics may be science-based, but also traverse history, psychology, religion, music, literature, and the arts. Our readers are particularly interested in practical mysticism and spirituality. You are all invited to volunteer your talents as an author, a scientific investigator, a translator, a peer reviewer, or a copy editor. Anyone can volunteer. Please email editor@rosicrucian.org. Over the next few months, we are highlighting certain authors and their papers as published in our current volume during our Wednesday teleconferences. We hope you can join us for each one. Today, we are pleased to present Frater Raul Passos. He is the current AMORC, that is Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucius, Grand Administrator for the Romanian jurisdiction and author of the Rose Quadjournal paper, Rose of the Occult, Cross of the Revealed, Esoteric Evidence in the work of Claude Debussy. Frater Passos was born and grew up in Brazil in a family of Portuguese descent. Early in life, he discovered his gift as a pianist. In fact, I would say that he was probably a child prodigy. And he received his master's degree in music, in piano, while studying in Bucharest, Romania. Fascinated by this country, back in Brazil, he started to work as a Romanian and French translator, and shortly thereafter worked at the Portuguese-speaking Grand Lodge of AMORC. Frater Raul speaks Portuguese, Romanian, French, English, Italian, Spanish, and Russian with different levels of mastery. As a young man, he was always interested in spirituality, and above all, in Eastern philosophies. Within AMORC, he served in various roles, especially at the Pronaos, Lodge, and Martinist Heptad levels. He is also one of the founders of the Pronaos Curativa Centro. In 2016, he was invited by then Imperator Christian Bernard to settle in Romania in order to develop the Romanian administration of AMORC. And in February 2020, Frater Pasos was installed ritualistically as Grand Administrator by Imperator Claudio Mazzucco at the headquarters of the Italian-speaking Grand Lodge. In addition to classical music, Frater Raul treasures literature. He is the author of a book of poems. He also loves animals, international culture, languages, cooking, and gardening. He lives in Bucharest with his wife, Sor Renata, his son Samuel, and his cat, Pint. Please welcome us. Welcome Raul Passos today, and I'm going to turn the teleconference over to Frater Raul. Thank you so much.
Dear sorores, dear fratres, dear friends, good afternoon for most of you, good evening here for me. I would like to begin this brief lecture by thanking the Grand Master, Sir Julie Scott, for the invitation that has been made to me. Despite the physical distance and isolation accentuated by the pandemic, this type of initiative highlights the strength that exists in our fraternity and makes us sure that the bonds that unite us are in fact woven on a more subtle level and are unbreakable. It is a great joy for me, therefore, to be with you today. Since the purpose of this conference is not to reproduce in full the paper that was published in the latest edition of the Rosicrucianism journal, I conceived a lighter and more summarized version of the theme, bringing you also some musical examples that I believe will help to awaken or increase even more the interest in the work of this great master that humanity has known, the quite revolutionary Claude Debussy. I also took the opportunity to insert in the presentation a few quotes and considerations that were not included in the paper, some of them because they were discovered later, but which I believe further enrich the subject. Let us begin, therefore, our journey with a quote from Albert Einstein, well known to the Rosicrucians and the first monographs. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed. To know that what is impenetrable to us really exists, manifesting itself as the highest wisdom and the most radiant beauty which our dull faculties can comprehend, only in their most primitive forms, this knowledge, this feeling, is at the center of true religiousness. This is the meaning that we, as Rosicrucians, attribute to the word mystery, and the term religiousness can perfectly translate, in this case, the sense of intimate and profound communion that we experience without intermediaries with divinity. It is this very mystery that we have identified and are now trying to scrutinize in Debussy's work. French pianist Marguerite Long, who had the opportunity to meet Debussy and to study many of his works directly with the master, evokes, recalling his music, the spell it is capable of producing. How many of us, hearing his work for the first time, felt that an unknown star lit up the sky? How many of us have followed it to the threshold of the master, bringing him the gold, the incense, and the myrrh of our astonished senses? She also evokes an au-delà sonore, a sonorous other world, in the bosom of which Debussy listened to his music, endeavoring to rediscover those sounds, translate them, transcribe them, restart them, until the performance, or the officiant, we could say, can reveal in turn these sublime harmonies. She also mentions the role played by the composer's wife, Emma, as a confidant and counselor in this quest that she describes as almost mystical. There are few biographies and studies dedicated to Debussy that do not mention his relationship with the world of the occult. However, no document is absolutely assertive as to his belonging or affiliation with any movement. Debussy himself knew or wanted to be wrapped with a veil of mystery in this regard, and on the rare occasions when he let show his personal engagements, he did so in his personal correspondence or just left us musical clues throughout his work. Let us briefly recapitulate the concept of esotericism before looking for it in Debussy's world. French art historian and writer Luc Benoit puts it this way. In a general perspective, we find among certain Greek philosophers the notion of esotericism applied to an oral teaching, transmitted to some elected disciples. Although it is difficult to know its nature in these conditions, we can deduce from these same conditions that this teaching surpassed the level of a philosophy and a rational exposure to reach a deeper truth, destined to make the disciple's whole being penetrate wisdom, and at the same time, his soul and his spirit. Antoine Fèvre, in turn, a renowned scholar of Western esotericism, identifies four characteristics of esotericism. A theory of correspondence, this is interconnection of all things in the universe, the belief in a living and conscious nature, the belief in the operative and magical power of the symbolic imagination, and the transformation of matter from inner evolution, alchemy. English composer Cyril Scott, in his ambitious and overwhelming work, Music and its Secret Influence Throughout the Ages, attributes precisely to esotericism the particular and distinctive character of true works of art. Materialism offers no convincing explanation for that mysterious charm, that elusive something which renders a number of works of art immortal. Nor can materialism or even orthodox religion convincingly account for genius. It is only esotericism which affords a satisfying explanation. And finally, it is the philosopher and musicologist Vladimir Jankelevich who invites us to dive into the world of Debussy with the following words. There is mystery and there is secret. The indefinable thing that Debussy expresses is not something secret, but something mysterious. Mystery is the prerogative of music. But no musician went further than Claude Debussy in suggesting and transcribing mysterious things. His music, in fact, gradually evolved from secret to mystery. It initially finds food in the occultist and Rosicrucian Paris of the 1880s, in this Paris of Chat Noir and Sarpe-Ladon, where mysticism is sometimes transformed into mystification. It is the same Jankelevich who, speaking of the opera Péléas et Mélisande, which we are not going to address here because it demands a separate work entirely dedicated to it, identifies the capacity to listen in to souls communicating with one another in the ether, and even to convey the equivocal sensation of what is at the same time here and there, near and far, being and non-being, or still, presence of absence and absence of presence. It is in the last years of the 19th century that, while symbolism makes a splash in the cultural environment of Paris, renewing interest in mysticism and the occult sciences, bookstores become meeting points for thinking heads. One of them, L'Art Indépendant, sees some famous characters gather among its shelves, such as Joséphin Péladan, Papus, Toulouse-Lautrec, Degas, Mallarmé, Éric Satie, and Claude Debussy. It is from this time that his cantata La Demoiselle Élue dates, and about which years later he would write a little oratorio in a mystical and slightly pagan note. Edmond Bailly, the owner of L'Art Indépendant, also edits a few works by Debussy, who in this autograph note expresses his thanks for the literary soirée promoted in the bookstore. Victor-Émile Michelet, a well-known name among the Martinists, evokes that, being able to express himself freely there, Debussy let himself be thoroughly impregnated with Hermetic philosophy, involving reputedly ancient Egyptian theories of magic and alchemy. The association between Debussy and Péladan also dates from that time, when Péladan revived the Rosicrucian movement and installed the headquarters of his Rosicrucian Order of the Temple and the Grail on the first floor of the Café Auberge du Clou, frequented by Debussy and Satie. The proximity between the two composers allows us to place at that time the connection of both to the Rosicrucian fraternity. In fact, Satie dedicates a copy of his Sonnerie de la Rose-Croix to Debussy with the following terms: to my good old Claude Achille Debussy, from his brother in our Lord, Éric Satie, October 27, 1892. Satie, in addition, formalized his collaboration with Péladan in multiple happenings led by the novelist, of which undoubtedly the most famous were the Salon de la Rose-Croix, for which Satie composed music. However, the musical work of the two composers is uneven from this point on, whereas Satie, whose technical capacities were more modest, disperses into eccentricities and condenses his production into musical miniatures of a predominantly anecdotal taste, Debussy, whose genius unquestionably bears fruit in a more disciplined and ambitious way, devotes himself to larger scale compositions and seeks other types of extra musical associations. Most likely, Debussy's fascination with esotericism and with his efforts to translate it into his music come from the time when he met Charles de Sivry, a Kabbalist and occultist. What is particularly notable is his inescapable inclination towards the inspirational stimuli found in the mysteries of the ancient East, Egypt, and Greece. The examples are numerous and quite evident, especially in the context of the setting or ambience of his works. Canope, from the second book of Prelude for piano, alludes to Canopus, an Egyptian mythological god, and to the canopic vase, a type of funerary jar used in pharaonic Egypt. Danseuse de Delphes is an allusion to the temple of Delphi, where the famous maxim, know thyself, was engraved. Also, fantastic beings affiliated collaterally with the world of mysticism, esotericism, are recurrent elements throughout his production. Let's see some examples. Ondine, also from the second book of Prelude, refers to an aquatic nymph of extraordinary beauty with feminine human features but no soul, mentioned first in the alchemical work of the physician and Rosicrucian Paracelsus. Mermaids, the second of Debussy's Nocturne for orchestra, brings us the fabulous creatures with the head and torso of a woman who, due to the sweetness of their song, attract navigators to their reefs. They are traditionally associated with the mundane seductions and trials that mark out the initiatic pathways. Puck, a British folklore fairy and capricious creature, sometimes described as a nature sprite, and whose most notable appearance occurs in A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare, is evoked by Debussy in the first book of Prelude in La Danse de Puck. Syrinx, a nymph from the Greek mythology, symbol of chastity, is the title of a little piece that Debussy wrote for solo flute and that remains an integral part of the repertoire of that instrument. Fairies, legendary beings of great beauty and capable of casting spells, are also evoked in the second book of Prelude in Les fées sont d'exquises danseuses. The fairies are exquisite dancers. Pan, a divinity of nature, protector of shepherds and flocks, and in close relationship with the aforementioned Syrinx, is evoked twice by Debussy in his work. He appears in the song La Flûte de Pan, on a text by the symbolist poet Pierre Louis, and in Pour invoquer Pan, le dieu du vent d'été, to invoke Pan, god of the summer wind, part of the suite for two pianos, Six Epigraphes Antiques. The faun, a country creature from Roman mythology, occupies a special place in the production of Debussy. He's the theme of the song Les Faunes, on a text by the symbolist poet Paul Verlaine, and of the famous Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun for orchestra, inspired by the homonymous poem by Stéphane Mallarmé. Regarding the golden ratio, one of the most absolute symbols of perfection in Western culture, we will find it in the formal and dynamic architecture of many of Debussy's compositions, especially in the ecstatic L'Île Joyeuse and the famous Clair de Lune, but also in La Mer and Reflet dans l'eau, these works being perfectly constructed according to the golden ratio. In this regard, a letter sent by Debussy to Jacques Durand, his editor, when preparing the Estampe edition, leaves us with an intriguing statement, since it is clear that the desire to conform to the golden ratio was much more than a banal aesthetic concern. Debussy said, "You will see on page 8 of Jardin sous la pluie that a bar is missing. My mistake, by the way, as it is not in the manuscript. However, it is necessary with regard to the number, the divine number." In this scheme that appears on this slide, you can see the golden ratio occurring in a structural and dynamic musical analysis of two works by Debussy, Hommage à Rameau and the second movement of La Mer. Here, we see the painting by Jean-Antoine Watteau that inspired Debussy to compose the aforementioned piano piece L'Île Joyeuse, the Joyous Island, from which we will listen to the final bars and which contains some of the greatest moments of emotional pathos in the composer's work. As the picture suggests, we find ourselves in a moment of sublime ecstasy and catharsis on an almost utopian island where perfection reigns. From the image, you can already imagine that I will now talk a little about what may be Debussy's best-known piece, Clair de Lune, Moonlight. As I said, the 72 bars of this true jewel in the piano repertoire are perfectly structured from a tonal point of view according to the golden ratio. It is likely that this also contributes to the inescapable feeling of beauty that entrances us when we listen to this piece. I propose to you now to do a brief meditation. Please sit comfortably, close your eyes, and take a series of deep breaths, feeling as relaxed as possible. Now, follow the perfectly harmonious flow of this musical jewel. Visualize yourself in the immensity of outer space, floating carefree, like the child in the welcoming and comforting womb of his mother. You see yourself now before the moon. It is immense. Its light, bright and warm, warms you and surrounds you completely in a regenerating cosmic embrace. Seized by a great emotion, a feeling of legitimate gratitude arises in our innermost self. Our heart, caressed by the gentle rays of the moonlight, vibrates with gratitude. I am grateful to the great infinite wisdom for the gift of music. I am grateful to the great infinite wisdom for the emotion it arouses in me. I am grateful to the great infinite wisdom for its regenerating power. I am grateful to the great infinite wisdom for music coloring the most precious moments of life. I am grateful to the great infinite wisdom for granting music the power to invite me to know the deepest and most true aspect of my inner self. May the moonlight, a reflection of the greater light, illuminate our days and always inspire us. So mote it be. Let us return calmly to the objective consciousness and open our eyes. I hope you enjoyed this brief experiment. The recording you heard is by the Swiss pianist Aubert Ferber, who was a member of our order. This wonderful recording can be found on the CD Treasures of the Rosicrucian Archives. One must look beyond the obvious. Ambiguity is always preferable to specificity. If the meaning is obvious, the nature of the symbol has been lost. The sentence by the French painter Odilon Redon, one of the exponents of the Salon de la Rose-Croix, could very well be the profession of faith of the entire symbolist movement. It can be associated with a statement by British scholar Tobias Churton, in which we identify this creed in a more subtle instance supporting the architecture of reliable works of art. While a musical statement may not conform to expected or traditional rhythms, repeats, codas, or melodic development, it possesses a hidden, underlying, unbreakable form, an occult form of celestial authority and coherence that prevents mere fancy from breaking the bounds of the internal laws of nature. The symbolist poetry of Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and Verlaine occupies a capital position in Debussy's creation. The vocal works he composed on texts by these authors are ubiquitous in his catalogue, and not only reflect the aesthetic evolution of his musical language, but also show his constant predilection for symbolist texts throughout his life. For him, and for symbolist poets, the esoteric nature of art was a central, almost dogmatic belief. Baudelaire's The Flowers of Evil, from which Debussy set to music 5 poems, is characterized by the deliberate probing of the duality of existence. It is also known that Baudelaire nourished himself with the ideas of the Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, which were apparent in his work. Additionally, Debussy attended several mardi soirs, Tuesday evening meetings, at Mallarmé's house, which were aimed at a scrupulously refined public, where he enjoyed the presentation of some of his productions inclining to mysticism. I left one of the points that most intrigued me in my research on esotericism and Debussy for the end of this conference. Cyrus Scott, in his work on music and its secret imprints that I mentioned earlier, claims that Debussy, especially in the second of his orchestral nocturne, Fête, or festivals, would have unconsciously reproduced the Atlantean Templar chants through Javanese music and under the influence of the higher ones. I must confess, dear fratres, sorores, and friends, that whenever I think about that possibility, I listen to that musical page and I feel a shiver down my spine. It is a statement whose grounds are virtually impossible to ascertain, but this statement does no less than stir our curiosity. As a part of what was a possible personal credo regarding the reform of the arts, Debussy once said, "I have made Mr.'s nature my relation." Those words could very well summarize his faith. In a letter addressed to his friend and fellow composer Ernest Chausson, Debussy even defended the idea of establishing an esoterical musical society, with the aim of creating music less accessible to the masses, who, according to his perception, were unable to understand true art. The English historian Frances Yates, who devoted part of her work to Rosicrucianism, repeatedly emphasizes the interest of the Rosicrucian fraternity in renewing and reforming the arts, considered as the image of the cosmos. Roy Howitt, author of a study on Debussy and the Golden Number, does not fail to point out Debussy's affinity with his creed, which echoes in his famous phrase, "Music is a mysterious mathematical process whose elements share something of the nature of infinity. It is allied to the movement of the waters, to the play of the curves described by the changing breezes. Nothing is more musical than a sunset, for anyone who can be moved by what they see can learn the greatest lessons in development here. That is to say, they can read them in nature's book." The very mention of the nature's book, for the mystics that we are, is in itself a testimony of the contact with a more subtle and hermetic knowledge. In this conception, the reform of the arts would aim at the recovery of a primordial harmony, a reintegration, as Martinist would say. The Rosicrucian order, Amorc, officially recognized both Debussy and Satie as having been formal members of the Rosicrucian fraternity. However, if on the one hand Satie openly took up his duties with the Péladan movement, making a fuss of it, Debussy, on the other hand, by virtue of his secretive and discreet personality, bequeathed us more question marks than answers regarding his mystical affiliations. In this regard, the Italian musicologist Alessandro Nardin offers us an insightful and judicious statement. Outer activism and inner involvement are not commensurable quantities. Quite the contrary. True initiatory participation is totally independent of ostentation, and the silence which Debussy always masterfully surrounded himself with is the most conscious expression of it. On the top left, we have a photo of Debussy on the beach in Normandy in 1911. By the way, what a beautiful bathing suit, isn't it? Polish musicologist Stefan Jarociński sublimely condenses Debussy's internal process. Regarding material imagination of the composer, he tells us, "It finds at the innermost heart of substances all the symbols of the intimate secrets of human life," said Gaston Bachelard. In order to arouse the atavistic correspondence which slumber in man, and to restore his union with the creatures and objects in nature, Debussy, unlike Wagner, has no need for semantic substitutes. All he needs is to speak directly through birdsong, the sound of the sea, the rocking of a boat by the waves, the movement of clouds in the sky, or drifting mists, to lead our thoughts to the origin of things and cause them to dwell on the ultimate questions in life. His music does not answer any questions, create any myths, or suggest any solutions, but for that very reason acts all the more forcefully on our minds and forces us to follow in its wake. To paraphrase the same author later, we would say that it's not the picture that interests Debussy, but the perception, not the rose itself, but its blossoming. And finally, quoting Vladimir Jankelevich once again, Debussy's music is like a miniature cosmogony, a recapitulation of the history of the world. There is no music in the world that speaks more profoundly to a man of his mystery, which so disturbs his inner being, or which stirs his imagination more profoundly, and speaks to man of his future. It is evident that Debussy's artistic and human ideals and his musical thinking were impregnated with a subtle and esoteric philosophy. His ideals, however, as well as his artistic creation, never bowed to material needs and never made concessions to the average popular taste, nor to the simple and mediocre. He said, "Those around me insist on not understanding that I have never been able to live in the reality of things and people, whence this inexpressible need to escape from myself in adventures which seem inexplicable, because there appears a man whom we do not know. It may be the best in me. Besides, an artist is by definition someone used to dreams and who lives among ghosts." These words express in a confessional tone the nuances of his interior landscape, of which fauns, mermaids, fairies, saints, magical creatures, and Egyptian deities bear an undying testimony. Thank you very much, dear fratres and sorores and friends. Here you have a list of the bibliography consulted and the discography I used today. I hope you have enjoyed this trip, and I wish you all, dear fratres, sorores, and friends, a wonderful life. Peace profound.